The snow came down so thick that Violet Green could no longer see her own hands holding the reins, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was going to die out here in this white hell. She had been traveling from Sacramento to visit her ailing aunt in the mining camps near the Sierra Nevada foothills when the November storm of 1878 had swept down from the mountains with a fury that took everyone by surprise. Her stagecoach driver had tried to push through, insisting they could make it to Marysville before the worst hit, but the horses had panicked when lightning split the sky, bolting off the road and overturning the coach in a ravine. Violet had been thrown clear, landing in a snowdrift that probably saved her life in that moment, but the driver had not been so fortunate. She had found him pinned beneath the wreckage, already gone cold, and the horses had disappeared into the storm. That had been hours ago, or maybe it had been minutes. Time seemed to stretch and contract in strange ways when everything around you was white and howling. Violet had tried to stay with the overturned coach, thinking surely someone would come looking, but as the temperature dropped and the snow piled higher, she realized she would be buried alive if she stayed. So she had started walking, praying she was heading toward civilization rather than deeper into the wilderness. Her traveling cloak, which had seemed so warm and practical in Sacramento, now felt like little more than paper against the brutal wind. Her fingers had gone numb inside her gloves, and her feet felt like blocks of ice in her leather boots. She stumbled over something hidden beneath the snow and fell hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. For a long moment she lay there, tempted to simply close her eyes and let the cold take her. It would be easy. The snow was surprisingly soft, almost comfortable, but something in her refused to give up so easily. Violet was 22 years old, and she had already survived losing both parents to cholera, working her fingers raw as a seamstress to support herself, and enduring the unwanted advances of every man who thought a woman alone was fair game. She had not fought so hard to stay alive and independent only to freeze to death in a California blizzard. With tremendous effort, she pushed herself back to her feet. The world spun dangerously, and she realized that the cold was affecting her thinking now. That was bad. She had heard stories about people who froze to death, how they became confused and disoriented at the end. She forced herself to keep moving, one foot in front of the other, even though she could no longer feel her legs properly. The wind screamed in her ears, drowning out all other sound. She thought she saw lights ahead, golden and warm and inviting, but when she stumbled toward them, they vanished. Hallucinations, probably. Then she fell again, and this time she could not seem to make her body obey her commands to rise. Her muscles simply would not respond. The snow was piling up around her already, covering her dark cloak in a white shroud. Well, she thought distantly, at least it was a beautiful place to die. Even through the storm, she could sense the wild majesty of this land. Perhaps in spring, some traveler would find her bones and wonder who she had been. She did not remember closing her eyes, but suddenly, everything went dark and mercifully quiet. Dalton Fletcher had been ranching in the foothills outside Marysville for 6 years, ever since he had mustered out of the cavalry at age 20 and used his savings to buy a small plot of land and a handful of cattle. He was 26 now, and his ranch had grown to something he could be proud of. 300 acres of decent grazing land, a sturdy house he had built with his own hands, a barn that could shelter his horses and cattle through the worst weather, and a growing herd that would make this year profitable if he could just get the animals through the winter without losing too many to the cold or predators. When the storm hit, he had been prepared. He had spent the previous 2 days moving his cattle to the lower pastures where they would have some protection from the wind, and ensuring that his horses were safely in the barn with plenty of hay and water. His ranch hand, an older man named Pete who had worked cattle drives for 20 years before his knees gave out, was bunking in the small cabin behind the main house, and Dalton had made sure Pete had enough firewood stacked to last a week if necessary. The house was stocked with provisions, and Dalton had settled in to wait out the storm, reading by lamplight and occasionally adding wood to the fire. But by the second day, the storm had not let up, and Dalton began to worry. This was worse than any blizzard he had experienced in his 6 years here. The snow was piling up past the windows, and the temperature had dropped so low that ice was forming on the inside of the glass, despite the roaring fire. When he checked on Pete that afternoon, fighting his way through waist-deep snow to reach the cabin, the older man had looked grim. "Never seen one like this," Pete said, shaking his head. "And I have seen plenty. This is the kind that kills people who do not have shelter." "Everyone in town should be safe enough," Dalton said, though he felt uneasy. "The stage from Sacramento was supposed to come through yesterday. I hope they had the sense to turn back." Pete gave him a look. "When have stage drivers ever had that much sense? They get paid to deliver passengers, storm or no storm." The words haunted Dalton as he made his way back to the house, bent nearly double against the wind. He could not shake the feeling that something was wrong, that someone out there needed help. He tried to tell himself he was being foolish, that no one could have survived this storm outside, but the feeling persisted. Finally, as the light began to fail on the second evening, he could not stand it any more. He bundled himself in his heavy sheepskin coat, wrapped a wool scarf around his face, pulled his hat down tight, and headed out on his most reliable horse, a sturdy gelding named Buck, who had never spooked at anything. Pete tried to talk him out of it, but Dalton was stubborn when he got an idea in his head. He told Pete he was just going to ride out toward the main road, just to check, just to make sure. The visibility was terrible, and more than once Dalton thought about turning back. This was madness. But Buck plodded forward steadily, and Dalton trusted the horse's instincts. They had gone perhaps a mile from the ranch when Buck suddenly stopped and refused to go forward. Dalton urged him on, but the horse planted his feet and whinnied nervously. "What is it, boy?" Dalton asked, peering through the snow. At first he saw nothing but white, but then he noticed a dark shape that did not quite match the landscape. His heart began to pound. He dismounted and waded through the deep snow, and that was when he saw her. She was half buried in a snowdrift, and for a terrible moment he thought she was already dead. Her lips were blue, her skin was deathly pale, and he could not see any sign of breathing. But when he pressed his fingers to her neck, he felt a pulse, faint and slow but there. She was alive, barely. Dalton did not hesitate. He scooped her up in his arms, shocked at how light she was, how cold. Her clothes were soaked through, frozen in places. He got her onto Buck, holding her in front of him so she would not fall, and turned the horse back toward home. The ride back seemed to take forever, and several times he checked to make sure she was still breathing. Her breath came in shallow, barely visible puffs against his chest. When he finally made it back to the ranch, he shouted for Pete, and together they got her into the house. Dalton laid her on the floor in front of the fire, and Pete brought blankets while Dalton began carefully removing her frozen outer garments. Her cloak cracked like ice as he peeled it away, and her dress beneath was stiff with frost. "We need to warm her up slowly," Pete said. "Too fast, and it will shock her system. I have seen men die from being warmed too quick after freezing." Dalton nodded, his hands working carefully to remove her wet dress. He tried not to think about the impropriety of undressing a strange woman, focusing only on saving her life. Beneath her dress, she wore a corset and chemise, also damp, and he removed those as well, wrapping her in dry blankets as quickly as he could. Her fingers were an alarming white color, as were her toes, and he feared frostbite. They positioned her close to the fire, and Dalton rubbed her hands and feet gently, trying to restore circulation. Pete heated water and filled several canteens, wrapping them in cloth and placing them around her body to provide warmth without burning her. For hours they worked, and for hours she remained unconscious, barely breathing. "Come on," Dalton whispered, rubbing her icy hands between his own. "Come on, fight. You did not survive out there just to die now." Sometime past midnight she stirred. It was just a small movement, a flutter of her eyelids, but it was enough to make Dalton's heart leap. He leaned closer, speaking gently. "Can you hear me? You are safe now. You are inside, out of the storm." Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then gradually sharpening. They were a remarkable green, he noticed, like new leaves in spring. She stared at him in confusion, then looked around the unfamiliar room, and panic flooded her expression. "Easy," Dalton said quickly. "You are all right. I found you in the snow. You were nearly frozen. This is my ranch outside Marysville. You are safe here." She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a hoarse croak. Pete appeared with a cup of warm broth, and Dalton helped her sit up slightly, holding the cup to her lips. She managed a few sips before falling back against the pillows, exhausted by even that small effort. "The driver," she whispered. "He was killed when the coach overturned." Dalton exchanged a grim look with Pete. "Where did this happen?" "I do not know," she said, and tears began to slide down her pale cheeks. "I walked for so long, I was trying to find help." "You found it," Dalton said firmly. "You are going to be all right, just rest now." Over the next 3 days, the storm finally began to ease, and Violet slowly recovered from her ordeal. Dalton had given her his bed, insisting he was perfectly comfortable sleeping by the fire, and Pete had brought her meals and tended to her needs with the gruff kindness of a man who had raised 4 daughters of his own. Her fingers and toes had been frostbitten, but not so badly that she would lose any, and the feeling gradually returned to them along with considerable pain that she bore with gritted teeth and few complaints. Dalton found himself drawn to her in a way he had not expected. She was beautiful, certainly, with her auburn hair and those striking green eyes, but it was more than that. There was a strength in her, a determination that he recognized because he saw it in himself. She did not weep or wail about her misfortune. Instead, she asked practical questions about when the roads might be passable again, about whether anyone had been sent to search for the overturned stage, about how she might send word to her aunt that she was alive. "The roads will not be clear for at least another week," Dalton told her on the 4th day, when she was finally strong enough to sit at the table for breakfast. "Maybe longer, and even when they are passable, it will take time to organize a search party. But I will go out myself as soon as it is safe and try to find the coach." "I should go with you," Violet said immediately. "I am the only one who knows where it is." "You are in no condition to ride out in this weather," Dalton said firmly. "You nearly died once already." "I will not risk you going through that again." "I am not asking your permission," Violet said, her chin lifting stubbornly. "That man deserves a proper burial. His family deserves to know what happened to him, and there were things in the coach, including my belongings, that I need." Dalton met her eyes and saw that she was serious. Part of him admired her determination, but another part wanted to lock her in the house to keep her safe, which was a ridiculous impulse for a woman he had known for 4 days. He sighed. "Fine. But we wait until the weather clears completely and you stay on a horse where I can keep an eye on you. A small smile touched her lips. Agreed. Pete snorted from where he was frying bacon at the stove. You two are both stubborn as mules. This ought to be interesting. Over the following days, as they waited for the weather to improve, Dalton and Violet talked. She told him about her life in Sacramento, about losing her parents and making her own way in the world as a seamstress. She spoke with pride about the little shop she had managed to open, about the wealthy clients who commissioned gowns from her, about her plans to expand her business. She had been traveling to see her mother's sister, who had written to say she was ill and wanted to see Violet one more time. Dalton told her about his own journey, about growing up in Missouri as the youngest of 5 brothers, about joining the cavalry at 18 to escape his father's farm, and the future that had been laid out for him. He spoke about the years patrolling the frontier, about seeing this land and falling in love with it, about deciding to make something of his own out here. Why ranching? Violet asked. They were sitting by the fire after dinner, Pete having retired early to his cabin. The question was innocent enough, but Dalton found himself giving her a more honest answer than he had given anyone else. Because it is mine, he said simply. Every fence post I put in the ground, every calf born on this land, every acre I improve. It belongs to me because I built it with my own hands. My father owned his farm, but it was going to my oldest brother, and the rest of us were expected to work for him for the rest of our lives. I wanted something that was mine. Violet nodded slowly. I understand that. It is why I started my shop. I was tired of working for other people, of making beautiful things and watching them take the credit and the profit. I wanted something that was mine too. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition. Dalton felt his heart beat a little faster. He had known plenty of women in his life, had even been engaged once to a girl back in Missouri, who had written him a Dear John letter 6 months into his cavalry service. But he had never met a woman quite like Violet Green, who had survived a blizzard through sheer determination, and who spoke about her business with the same passion he felt about his ranch. He was falling for her, he realized with some alarm. Falling hard and fast, like a calf roped at a full gallop. The thought should have frightened him, but instead it felt right, like coming home after a long journey. The weather finally broke after 10 days, the sun emerging to shine on a world transformed by snow. Dalton, Violet, and Pete set out to find the overturned stagecoach, with Violet riding beside Dalton and doing her best to remember the direction she had traveled. It took most of the day, but they eventually found the wreckage in a ravine about 3 miles from Dalton's ranch, buried under several feet of snow. The driver was still there, frozen solid, and they dug him out carefully. Dalton recognized him as a man named Charlie West, who ran the Sacramento route. While Pete and Dalton worked to free the body, Violet searched through the coach for her belongings and found her trunk, mostly intact. Inside were her clothes and, more importantly, the money she had been carrying to help her aunt. She had been terrified it would be gone. They wrapped Charlie in blankets and brought him back to the ranch, where they would keep him until the roads to town were clear enough to notify the authorities and his family. It was grim work, but Violet insisted on helping, and Dalton found he could not refuse her. That evening, as they sat exhausted by the fire, Violet turned to him with serious eyes. "I owe you my life," she said quietly. "If you had not come looking for me, I would be as dead as Charlie. How can I ever repay you?" "You do not owe me anything," Dalton said immediately. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Violet said firmly. "Not anyone. Most people would not have gone out in that storm. Most people would have stayed safe inside and told themselves there was nothing they could do. But you came anyway. That means something." Dalton felt heat rise in his face that had nothing to do with the fire. "I am just glad I found you in time." "So am I," Violet said softly, and the way she looked at him made his breath catch. The roads to Marysville cleared 2 days later, and Dalton hitched up his wagon to take Violet into town. She needed to send a telegram to her aunt to let her know what had happened and that she would be delayed. They also needed to report Charlie's death to the sheriff and arrange for his body to be transported back to his family in Sacramento. Marysville was a bustling town, grown prosperous from the gold and silver mines in the nearby mountains. The main street was lined with shops and businesses, saloons and hotels, and despite the recent storm, people were out and about, digging out from the snow and getting on with their lives. Dalton drove the wagon to the telegraph office first, where Violet composed a message to her aunt explaining what had happened. Then they went to the sheriff's office, where Sheriff Tom Bradley listened to their story with a grave expression. "Charlie West was a good man," the sheriff said, shaking his head. "His wife is going to take this hard. They have 3 little ones at home. I will send word to Sacramento and make sure he gets home proper." After they had finished their business, Dalton suggested they stop at the hotel restaurant for lunch. Violet agreed, and they sat at a table by the window, watching the townspeople go by. A waitress brought them coffee and stew, and for a while they ate in comfortable silence. "What will you do now?" Dalton asked finally. "Will you continue on to see your aunt?" Violet stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "I should. She is expecting me and she is not well, but the truth is, I am not eager to get back on a stagecoach anytime soon. The thought of it makes my hands shake." "That is understandable," Dalton said. "You went through a terrible ordeal." "Maybe I could stay in Marysville for a while," Violet said slowly, as if the idea was just occurring to her. "I could set up a temporary shop, take in sewing. There must be women here who need dresses made or mended. And it would give me time to recover before attempting the trip again." Dalton's heart leaped at the thought of her staying, but he tried to keep his voice casual. "That sounds like a good plan. I am sure you would find plenty of work. This town is growing fast, and there are not many skilled dressmakers around." "There is one problem," Violet said, meeting his eyes. "I do not know anyone here except you and Pete. I do not know which boarding houses are respectable or which shops might have space to rent. I do not know anything about this town." "I could help you with that," Dalton offered immediately. "I know most of the business owners in town. I could introduce you around, help you get settled." A smile spread across Violet's face, genuine and warm. "Would you? That would be wonderful." They spent the rest of the afternoon walking through Marysville, and Dalton introduced Violet to shopkeepers and business owners he knew. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store, mentioned that there was a small space above her shop that was currently empty, and it could be rented cheaply. They went to look at it and found a single room with a window overlooking the main street, not large but clean and well lit. There was even a small stove in one corner for heat and cooking. "It is perfect," Violet said, looking around with growing excitement. "I could set up my sewing machine here and use that corner for consultations with clients. Yes, this could work very well." Mrs. Henderson, a plump woman with kind eyes, smiled broadly. "I would be happy to have you, dear. It has been empty for 6 months now, and it would be nice to have someone upstairs again. $10 a month if that suits you." Violet agreed, and just like that, she had a place in Marysville. Dalton helped her carry her trunk up from the wagon, and they spent the next hour making the space habitable, cleaning dust from the corners and airing out the mattress on the narrow bed. By the time they finished, the sun was setting, and Dalton realized he needed to get back to the ranch. "Will you be all right here on your own?" he asked, suddenly reluctant to leave her. "I will be fine," Violet assured him. "Mrs. Henderson said she would bring up some spare blankets and dishes, and I am used to taking care of myself." "I know you are," Dalton said. He hesitated, then added, "I come into town for supplies most Saturdays. Maybe I could check on you then, see how you are settling in." "I would like that," Violet said softly. "Very much." They stood there for a moment, neither quite willing to say goodbye. Finally, Dalton forced himself to turn toward the door. "Saturday, then," he said. "Saturday," Violet agreed. Over the following weeks, a pattern developed. Dalton would come to town each Saturday, ostensibly for supplies but really to see Violet. She had wasted no time setting up her dressmaking business, and word had spread quickly that there was a skilled seamstress in town. Women began coming to her with orders for new dresses, alterations, and repairs. Violet worked long hours, but she always made time when Dalton came to visit. They would walk through the town together, or sit in the hotel restaurant drinking coffee and talking. Dalton told her about the ranch, about his plans to expand his herd and maybe build a bigger barn. Violet told him about her clients, about the elaborate wedding dress she was making for the mayor's daughter, about the ridiculous hat a mining magnate's wife had asked her to trim with peacock feathers. People in town began to notice them together, and there was talk. Dalton's friend Jack Morrison, who owned the feed store, ribbed him about it one Saturday when Dalton came in for grain. "So when are you going to marry that pretty dressmaker?" Jack asked with a grin. "Half the town is taking bets on it." "I have not asked her," Dalton said, feeling his ears go hot. "We are just friends." "Friends," Jack repeated skeptically. "Right, and I am the King of England. Listen, Dalton, I have known you for 6 years, and I have never seen you look at a woman the way you look at her. If you care about her, you had better stake your claim before someone else does. There are plenty of men in this town who would be happy to court a woman like her." The thought sent a spike of jealousy through Dalton that surprised him with its intensity. Jack was right. Violet was beautiful, talented, and independent. She would not lack for suitors if she wanted them. But did she want them? Did she feel the same way about him that he felt about her? He decided to find out. That Saturday, instead of their usual lunch at the hotel, he asked Violet if she would like to come out to the ranch for the day. She agreed immediately, her face lighting up in a way that made his heart race. "I have been curious about your ranch," she admitted as they drove out of town in his wagon. "You talk about it so much, I feel like I already know it, but I would love to see it for myself." When they arrived, Dalton gave her the full tour. He showed her the house, which was simple but solidly built, with a large main room that served as kitchen and living area, and 2 smaller bedrooms. He took her to see the barn, where his horses greeted them with interested whinnies, and out to the pastures where his cattle grazed peacefully in the winter sun. Pete joined them for part of the tour, clearly pleased to see Violet again and looking well. "This place has grown since I was last here," Violet said, looking around with obvious appreciation. "You have done amazing work, Dalton." "It is getting there," Dalton said, trying not to sound too proud and failing. "I want to build a bigger house eventually, something with a proper parlor and maybe a library, and I am thinking of adding some sheep, diversifying a bit." "It sounds like you have big plans," Violet said, smiling up at him. "I do," Dalton said. Then, gathering his courage, he added, "But lately I have been thinking that a ranch is not much good if you do not have someone to share it with." Violet's smile faded, and she looked at him seriously. "What are you saying, Dalton?" "I am saying that I care about you," Dalton said, the words tumbling out now that he had started. "More than care about you. I think I have been falling in love with you since the day I pulled you out of that snowdrift. I know we have not known each other very long, and I know you have your own business and your own life. But I wanted you to know how I feel. I wanted you to know that if you ever wanted to build something with someone, I would be honored if it was with me." For a long moment, Violet just looked at him and Dalton's heart sank. He had said too much, pushed too hard. But then she stepped closer to him and reached up to cup his face in her hand. "You are not the only one who has been falling," she said softly. "I tried to tell myself it was just gratitude, that I was confused because you saved my life. But it is more than that. When I am with you, I feel like I can be myself completely. I feel safe and challenged and excited all at once. I have never felt that way with anyone before." "Then stay," Dalton said, covering her hand with his own. "Not just in Marysville, stay here with me. Marry me, Violet, build a life with me." "Yes," Violet said, and there were tears in her eyes now, but they were happy tears. "Yes, I will marry you." Dalton pulled her into his arms and kissed her, a long, deep kiss that seemed to seal a promise between them. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless and grinning. "We should probably tell Pete," Violet said, laughing, "before he hears us and thinks something scandalous is happening out here." "Something scandalous is happening out here," Dalton said, kissing her again. "I am kissing a woman I am not married to. Yet." They told Pete the news, and the older man whooped with joy and insisted on breaking out a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion. They toasted to the future, to love, to second chances. Violet sent a telegram to her aunt the next day, explaining that she had met someone and would be staying in California. Her aunt wrote back with her blessing and an invitation to visit when she was well enough to travel. They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Marysville, with half the town in attendance. Violet wore a dress she had made herself, simple but elegant in ivory silk, and she carried wildflowers that Dalton had ridden out at dawn to pick for her. Pete stood up as Dalton's best man, and Mrs. Henderson served as Violet's matron of honor. The ceremony was short and sweet, and when the minister pronounced them man and wife, Dalton kissed his bride to enthusiastic applause. They held a reception at the hotel, with food and music and dancing that lasted well into the evening. Violet danced with Dalton, with Pete, with the sheriff and the mayor and half a dozen ranchers and miners who all wanted to congratulate the bride. But her eyes kept finding Dalton across the room, and every time their gazes met, he felt that same jolt of recognition and rightness that he had felt the first time they talked by his fire. Finally, as the evening wound down, they made their excuses and headed back to the ranch, to the home that was now theirs together. Dalton had spent the past week fixing up the house, adding little touches he thought Violet would like. Fresh curtains in the windows, a new rug by the hearth, a bookshelf he had built to hold the books she had brought from Sacramento. "It is perfect," Violet said, looking around the main room with shining eyes. "Our home." "Our home," Dalton agreed. He picked her up and carried her over the threshold, and she laughed, her arms around his neck. He set her down gently and then kissed her again, slower this time, with all the love and promise he felt for their future. That night, as they lay together in the bed that was now theirs, Violet traced patterns on Dalton's chest and spoke quietly in the darkness. "Sometimes I think about that day in the snow," she said. "How close I came to dying. And then I think about everything that has happened since, and it feels like a miracle." "It was a miracle," Dalton said, pulling her closer. "The miracle of finding you, the miracle of you saying yes." "I will always say yes to you," Violet murmured, already half asleep. Dalton listened to her breathing slow and even out as she drifted off, and he stared up at the ceiling, marveling at how his life had changed. 6 months ago, he had been a solitary rancher, content with his land and his cattle and his simple life. Now he had a wife, a partner, someone to build dreams with. And it had all started with a blizzard and a desperate ride through the snow to find someone who needed saving. But the truth was, Dalton thought, Violet had saved him too. She had brought light and warmth into his life, had shown him that building something great was even better when you had someone to share it with. He fell asleep with his wife in his arms and gratitude in his heart. The first year of their marriage was not without challenges. Violet continued to run her dressmaking business, riding into town twice a week to meet with clients and work on orders. Dalton worried about her making the trip alone, but Violet was adamant that she wanted to maintain her independence and her business. They compromised, with Dalton teaching her to shoot and making sure she always carried a rifle when she traveled. The ranch demanded constant work, and there were times when Dalton was exhausted, when he fell into bed too tired to do more than kiss his wife goodnight. But there were also moments of perfect happiness. Evenings spent by the fire, reading aloud to each other. Mornings when they would ride out together to check on the herd, and Violet would point out a particularly beautiful sunrise or a hawk soaring overhead. Nights when they would lie in each other's arms and talk about their dreams for the future. In the spring of their first year together, Violet discovered she was pregnant. She told Dalton one morning at breakfast, simply and directly, and for a moment he could only stare at her in shock. Then joy flooded through him, and he jumped up so fast he knocked over his chair, sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around until she laughingly told him to stop before she got dizzy. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, as if he could not quite believe it. "We are going to be parents." "Yes, we are," Violet said, grinning at his excitement. "In about 7 months, if my calculations are correct." Dalton immediately became protective, insisting that Violet should not ride into town anymore, that she should not lift anything heavy, that she should rest more. Violet rolled her eyes at his fussing but secretly found it endearing. She compromised by reducing her trips to town and taking on fewer demanding projects, though she flatly refused to stop working entirely. "I am pregnant, not broken," she told him firmly when he suggested she might want to close her shop until after the baby was born. Women have been having babies and working at the same time since the beginning of humanity. I will be fine. As her belly grew, Dalton found himself preparing for the baby's arrival with the same determination he had brought to building his ranch. He converted the smaller bedroom into a nursery, building a cradle from oak wood, and sanding it smooth so there would be no splinters. Violet sewed tiny gowns and blankets, her face soft with a happiness that made Dalton's heart ache. Pete was nearly as excited as they were, already declaring himself the baby's honorary grandfather, and starting to carve a set of wooden animals as a gift. The people in Marysville who had embraced Violet as one of their own threw her a baby party, and she came home with more gifts than they knew what to do with. Blankets and booties, gowns and rattles, advice both solicited and unsolicited. "Mrs. Henderson told me I should drink raspberry leaf tea every day," Violet reported one evening, laughing. "And Mrs. Sullivan from the bakery insists that I should eat raw liver to make sure the baby gets enough iron. Meanwhile, the mayor's wife thinks I should be resting in bed for the entire last month." "Maybe you should," Dalton said, only half joking. The closer they got to Violet's due date, the more nervous he became. He had helped deliver countless calves and foals, but the thought of his wife going through childbirth terrified him. "I will be fine," Violet assured him, taking his hand and placing it on her swollen belly. "Feel that. The baby is strong. We are both going to be fine." On a warm November evening, almost exactly a year after the blizzard that had brought them together, Violet went into labor. Dalton sent Pete racing into town to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Patterson, while he stayed with Violet, holding her hand and trying not to panic. Violet was remarkably calm, breathing through the contractions and occasionally squeezing his hand hard enough to make his bones creak. "You are doing so well," he told her, wiping sweat from her forehead with a damp cloth. "You are the bravest person I have ever known." "Tell me that when this is over," Violet gasped, managing a weak smile between contractions. Mrs. Patterson arrived and immediately took charge, shooing Dalton out of the bedroom with instructions to boil water and find clean towels. Dalton paced the main room, flinching every time he heard Violet cry out. Pete sat at the table, trying to distract him with stories from his cattle-driving days, but Dalton barely heard him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was actually only 6 hours, he heard a new sound. A baby crying, strong and lusty. Mrs. Patterson opened the door, her face wreathed in smiles. "You have a son," she said. "A big, healthy boy, and your wife is doing just fine. Come meet your child." Dalton walked into the bedroom on shaking legs. Violet was propped up against the pillows, looking exhausted but radiant, and in her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had made. His son. His child. "Come here," Violet said softly. "Come meet Daniel." Dalton sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the baby. Daniel had a shock of dark hair, a red, scrunched-up face, and tiny, perfect fingers that curled into fists. As Dalton watched, the baby opened his eyes and seemed to look right at him. "Hello, Daniel," Dalton whispered. "I am your father. And I promise you, I am going to do everything in my power to give you a good life." "We both will," Violet said, leaning her head against Dalton's shoulder. "We will give him a good life together." The years that followed were full and rich. Daniel grew into a sturdy, curious boy who loved following his father around the ranch and helping with the animals. When he was 2, Violet gave birth to twin girls, Emily and Rose, who kept everyone on their toes with their energy and mischief. Pete, who had indeed become an honorary grandfather, delighted in spoiling all 3 children and teaching them everything from how to ride a horse to how to whittle. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Dalton added the sheep he had been planning, and Violet's dressmaking business evolved into a successful mail-order operation, with women from all over California and Nevada sending her orders. They built the bigger house Dalton had dreamed of, with a proper parlor and a library and bedrooms for each of the children. But despite their success, and the demands of raising 3 children and running a ranch and a business, Dalton and Violet always made time for each other. Every evening, after the children were in bed, they would sit together by the fire, just as they had in those early days, and talk about their day, their dreams, their love. On the 10th anniversary of the day Dalton had found Violet in the snow, he took her back to the spot where it had happened. The children stayed home with Pete, and Dalton and Violet rode out on a clear, cold November day that reminded them both of that long-ago blizzard. "It was right about here," Dalton said, pulling his horse to a stop. The landscape looked completely different without the snow, green and golden in the autumn sun. Buck stopped and would not go any farther, and there you were, half buried in the snow. "And you pulled me out," Violet said, "and brought me home and saved my life." "We saved each other," Dalton said, reaching across the space between their horses to take her hand. "You gave me something to live for beyond just the ranch. You gave me a family, a future, a reason to build something that will last." "You gave me a home," Violet said, her eyes bright with tears. "Not just this place, but a real home. A place where I belong, where I am loved for exactly who I am. You gave me roots and wings all at once." They dismounted and stood together in the place where their story had begun, holding each other close. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and pine. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, and Dalton thought about how strange and wonderful life was, how a terrible blizzard had brought him the greatest gift he had ever received. "I love you," he said, the words as true and necessary as breath. "I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "I love you too," Violet said, "always and forever." They rode back to the ranch together as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. When they arrived home, the children came running out to greet them. Daniel already 11 years old and the twins 9, all of them talking at once about what they had done while their parents were gone. Pete stood on the porch, grinning, and the smell of dinner cooking wafted from the open door. That evening after dinner, they all gathered in the parlor. Dalton read aloud from a book of adventure stories while Violet sewed and the children played with the toys Pete had carved for them over the years. It was an ordinary evening, the kind they had shared hundreds of times before, but it was also extraordinary in its simple perfection. Later, after the children were asleep, Dalton and Violet stood at the window of their bedroom, looking out at their land, their home, the life they had built together. Dalton wrapped his arms around his wife from behind, and she leaned back against him with a contented sigh. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Violet asked. "If the storm had not hit that day, or if you had not come looking for someone in trouble, or if Buck had not stopped at that exact spot." "I think about it sometimes," Dalton admitted, "and it terrifies me. If any one of those things had been different, I might never have found you. We might never have had this life." "But we did," Violet said, turning in his arms to face him. "We found each other against all odds, and we built something beautiful together." "We did," Dalton agreed. He kissed her, sweet and slow, a kiss that held 10 years of love and partnership and everything they meant to each other. "And we are going to keep building it for the rest of our lives." The next morning, Dalton woke early, as he always did, and lay for a moment watching the sunrise paint patterns on the ceiling. Beside him, Violet slept peacefully, and down the hall he could hear the children starting to stir. He thought about the day ahead, the work that needed to be done on the ranch, the meeting he had scheduled with a buyer interested in purchasing some of his cattle. Ordinary things, the business of everyday life. But as he got up and began to dress, he felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. Gratitude for the life he had, for the family that filled his home with love and laughter, for the woman who had warmed his heart on a cold winter day and had been warming it ever since. Violet stirred and opened her eyes, smiling when she saw him. "Good morning." "Good morning," Dalton said, coming to sit on the edge of the bed and taking her hand. "How did I get so lucky?" "Luck had nothing to do with it," Violet said, squeezing his fingers. "You rode out into a blizzard to save someone you did not even know existed. That was not luck. That was goodness, courage, the kind of man you are." "I am just a rancher," Dalton protested. "You are the man I love," Violet said simply. "The father of my children, my partner in everything." "You are my home, Dalton Fletcher." He kissed her again, and then there was a crash from the direction of the kitchen, followed by the twins' voices raised in some argument and Daniel shouting for them to be quiet. They looked at each other and laughed. "Duty calls," Violet said, starting to get up. "Let me," Dalton said. "You stay here and rest for a few more minutes. I will get breakfast started." He went to the kitchen, where he found Daniel trying to cook eggs and making a considerable mess of it, while the twins argued about whose turn it was to set the table. He sorted out the argument, taught Daniel the proper way to crack an egg, and started a pot of coffee. By the time Violet joined them, dressed for the day, breakfast was nearly ready and the children were sitting at the table, for once behaving themselves. It was a scene that repeated itself, with variations, almost every morning. The comfortable routine of a family that knew each other well and loved each other deeply. And as they sat down to eat, passing plates and talking about the day ahead, Dalton looked around the table and felt that sense of gratitude again. This was what he had ridden into a blizzard for, even if he had not known it at the time. Not just to save one woman's life, but to find his own purpose, his own happiness. To discover that building something great was even better when you built it with someone you loved. To learn that a frozen heart could be warmed, not just for a moment but for a lifetime. The years continued to pass, bringing joys and challenges as all years do. There were hard winters when they worried about the cattle and late springs when water was scarce. There were illnesses and injuries, fears and sorrows that came with living in a harsh and beautiful land. But there were also births and celebrations, harvests and holidays, the accumulation of small, perfect moments that made up a life well lived. Daniel grew into a fine young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did, and announced his intention to work it alongside Dalton for as long as he was able. The twins grew into spirited young women who inherited their mother's creativity and business sense. Emily wanted to expand the dressmaking business into a full storefront in Marysville, while Rose dreamed of writing books about life in the West. Pete lived to see all three children grown, passing peacefully in his sleep one night at the age of 78. They buried him on the ranch, on a hill overlooking the pastures he had helped to build, and Dalton gave a eulogy that had everyone in tears. Pete had been more than an employee or a friend. He had been family, and they mourned him as such, but life went on as it always does. Daniel married a girl from town, a sweet-natured young woman named Sarah who fit into the family as if she had always been there. They gave Dalton and Violet their first grandchild, a grandson they named Peter in honor of Pete. The twins pursued their dreams, Emily opening her store and Rose publishing her first book to considerable acclaim. Through it all, Dalton and Violet remained devoted to each other. They celebrated their 20th anniversary, their 25th, their 30th. Their hair turned gray and lines appeared on their faces, marks of lives fully lived. But when Dalton looked at Violet, he still saw the brave young woman he had pulled from the snow. And when Violet looked at Dalton, she still saw the strong, kind man who had saved her life and then given her a reason to live it. On a cold November day in 1908, 30 years to the day after the blizzard that had brought them together, they stood once again at the spot where Dalton had found Violet. They were both in their 50s now, but they still rode out together as often as they could, still made time for each other despite the demands of family and ranch and business. 30 years, Violet marveled, looking around at the familiar landscape. It feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. I know what you mean, Dalton said. He pulled her close, and they stood together in the cold wind, remembering. Sometimes I still dream about it, about searching through the snow, about finding you, about being afraid I was too late. But you were not too late, Violet said. You found me just in time, and you have been finding me, saving me every day since. You saved me too, Dalton said. You gave me a life I never imagined I could have. You gave me love and family and a home that is so much more than just land and buildings. You gave me everything. They stood together until the sun began to set, then rode back to the ranch, where their children and grandchildren waited. That evening, the whole family gathered for a celebration. Daniel and Sarah were there with their 3 children, Emily and her husband with their 2, Rose with her fiancé. The house rang with laughter and conversation, with the sounds of a family that was strong and healthy and happy. As Dalton looked around the crowded table, at all the faces of the people he loved, he felt overwhelmed with emotion. All of this, he thought, all of these wonderful people existed because he had ridden out into a blizzard 30 years ago. Because Violet had refused to give up, had fought to survive. Because they had found each other and chosen to build a life together. Later that night, after everyone had gone home or gone to bed, Dalton and Violet sat by the fire in the parlor, just the two of them in the quiet house. They had talked about this moment, about reaching the 30th anniversary of the day that had changed both their lives. They had wondered if it would feel momentous or just like any other day. It felt like both, Dalton decided. Momentous because of what it represented, all the years they had shared, all the love they had built. But also ordinary because every day with Violet felt special. Every morning he woke up beside her was a gift. Every evening they sat together like this was precious. "What are you thinking?" Violet asked, reaching over to take his hand. "I am thinking about how happy I am," Dalton said honestly. "How grateful, how blessed. I am thinking that I have lived a good life and the best part of it has been sharing it with you." "The best part of my life has been sharing it with you too," Violet said. Her green eyes, still as beautiful as they had been 30 years ago, shone with love. "You warmed my heart that day, Dalton, but you did not just warm it for a moment. You warmed it for life." Dalton pulled her close and kissed her, and in that kiss was everything they had shared and everything they would share in the years to come. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and gentle, coating the ranch in white. But inside, by the fire, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and deeply loved, Dalton and Violet Fletcher were warm. The years that followed were gentle ones. Dalton gradually handed over more of the ranch operations to Daniel, though he still rode out every day to check on things, and refused to be sidelined completely. Violet continued to work on special orders and helped Emily run the dress shop in town, taking pleasure in teaching her daughter and granddaughters the skills she had spent a lifetime perfecting. They became the respected elders of the community, the couple everyone pointed to as an example of what a good marriage looked like. Young people about to wed would sometimes ask them for advice, and Dalton would tell them that the secret was simple. Choose someone you respect as much as you love, someone who makes you want to be better, someone who will work beside you to build something great. And Violet would add that you also had to choose someone who made you laugh, who held you when you cried, who never stopped seeing you even when you were old and gray and not nearly as pretty as you used to be. Though Dalton would always interrupt at that point to insist that Violet was just as beautiful as the day he met her, and she would laugh and kiss him, and the young couple would leave feeling hopeful about their future. On their 40th anniversary, the whole family gathered for a grand celebration. There were grandchildren and great-grandchildren now, running around the big house that Dalton had built all those years ago. The walls held photographs documenting 4 decades of life together. Dalton and Violet on their wedding day, young and hopeful. Dalton holding baby Daniel. Violet with the twins. The whole family at Daniel's wedding, each grandchild being born. Holidays and harvests, ordinary days and special occasions. A life together, captured in images. That night as they lay in bed, Violet said quietly, "I hope I go first." Dalton's arms tightened around her. "Do not talk like that." "I am not being morbid," Violet said. "I am being practical. We are both getting older, Dalton. One of us will go before the other. And I hope it is me, because I cannot imagine living in a world without you in it." "Then let us make a deal," Dalton said. "We go at the same time in our sleep when we are very, very old after a very, very good life." Violet laughed softly. "I do not think we get to choose." "Maybe not," Dalton conceded. "But I do know this. However much time we have left, whether it is 1 year or 20, I plan to spend every single day of it loving you with everything I have." "That is all I want," Violet whispered. "Your love, it is all I have ever wanted." They fell asleep in each other's arms, and outside the window, stars wheeled across the California sky, silent witnesses to a love story that had begun in a blizzard and had endured for 4 decades and counting. They were granted another decade together, years that moved slowly and sweetly, like honey dripping from a spoon. They watched more grandchildren grow up and get married, welcomed more great-grandchildren into the world. They saw the new century unfold with all its changes and wonders. The ranch continued to thrive under Daniel's management, and the dress shop that Emily ran became one of the most successful businesses in Marysville. But the best moments were still the quiet ones. Mornings when they sat on the porch with their coffee, watching the sun rise over their land. Evenings when they took slow walks around the property, Dalton's arm around Violet's waist to steady her as her steps became less sure. Nights when they lay together and talked about the life they had shared, finding new things to marvel at even after 50 years of marriage. On a spring morning in 1928, 50 years to the day after they had married, Dalton woke before dawn and lay watching Violet sleep. They were both 72 years old now, and the years showed on their faces and in their movements. But to Dalton, his wife was as beautiful as ever, her face peaceful in sleep, her hair silver white against the pillow. He thought about everything they had been through together. The blizzard that had brought them together. The early days of their courtship and marriage. The births of their children, the growth of the ranch, the building of the life they had dreamed of. The challenges and triumphs, the sorrows and joys. 50 years of loving each other, 50 years of building something that would last long after they were gone. Violet stirred and opened her eyes, and when she saw him watching her, she smiled. "Good morning, husband," she said, her voice soft and full of affection. "Good morning, wife," Dalton replied. "Happy anniversary. 50 years, Violet marveled. Where did the time go?" "I do not know," Dalton said, "but I would not change a single day of it." They celebrated quietly, just the two of them, driving out to the spot where Dalton had found her all those years ago. It had become a tradition, this pilgrimage to the beginning of their story, and they had done it on every major anniversary. The landscape was green and lush now, completely different from the snow-covered wasteland it had been 50 years ago. "I was so frightened," Violet said, looking around. "So cold and so scared, I thought I was going to die out here." "But you did not die," Dalton said, putting his arm around her. "You survived. You fought. And then you let me love you, which was the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." "The greatest gift you gave me was not just saving my life," Violet said. "It was showing me what life could be. I had been so focused on being independent, on proving I could take care of myself, that I had never let anyone close. But you showed me that needing someone does not make you weak. It makes you human." They stood together for a long time, two old people who had loved each other for 50 years and planned to love each other for however many years remained. Then they drove back to the ranch, where their family had gathered for a celebration that lasted well into the evening. 2 years later, on a cold morning in late January, Dalton woke to find Violet still and silent beside him. She had gone in her sleep, peacefully, her face calm and content. For a long moment, he just lay there, holding her hand, feeling the weight of grief settle over him like a shroud. His wife, his love, his partner in everything was gone. The funeral was huge, with people coming from all over the state to pay their respects. Violet had touched so many lives with her kindness and her talent, her generosity and her strength. But Dalton barely registered any of it. He moved through the days in a fog of grief, going through the motions of living but feeling hollowed out inside. His children worried about him, about whether he would be able to go on without Violet. They had been together for so long, had been so devoted to each other, that it was hard to imagine one without the other. Daniel moved his father into his house, not wanting him to be alone, and the grandchildren took turns keeping him company. But it was not until a warm spring day, when Dalton went out to the spot where he had found Violet all those years ago, that he finally began to heal. He stood there, remembering, and it was as if he could feel her presence beside him. He could almost hear her voice telling him that she would not want him to give up, that there was still life to be lived, still family to love, still purpose to find. "I miss you," he said aloud, not caring if anyone heard him talking to empty air. "I miss you every moment of every day. But I know you would want me to go on, so I will. I will live for both of us now," and he did. For another 3 years, Dalton lived, finding joy in his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in watching the ranch continue to thrive, in seeing the legacy that he and Violet had built together continue into the future. He told stories about their life together to anyone who would listen, wanting to make sure that people remembered not just Violet, but what they had created together. On a quiet evening in November 1933, 55 years after the blizzard that had changed his life, Dalton sat in his chair by the fire in Daniel's house. The family was gathered around him, multiple generations filling the room with warmth and life. He looked at all of them, at the evidence of the love he and Violet had shared, and he felt profound peace. "Tell us the story, Grandpa," one of the great-grandchildren asked. "Tell us about how you found Grandma in the snow," and Dalton did, one more time. He told them about the storm, about the feeling that someone needed help, about Buck refusing to go forward, and then seeing that dark shape in the snow. He told them about bringing Violet home, about falling in love with her strength and courage, about asking her to marry him. He told them about 52 years of love, of partnership, of building something together that had lasted and would continue to last. When he finished, there were tears on many faces, but there were smiles too. It was a love story, after all, and love stories should be celebrated even when they end in grief, because they are proof that something beautiful and lasting is possible in this world. That night, Dalton went to bed feeling content. He had lived a good life, a full life, a life rich with love and purpose. He had saved a woman from a blizzard, and she had saved him right back, warming his heart not just for a moment but for the rest of his life. They had built something together that would outlast them both, a family and a legacy of love. He fell asleep thinking about Violet, about her green eyes and her determination, about the way she had looked on their wedding day and on the day each of their children was born and on their 50th anniversary. He fell asleep with a smile on his face and love in his heart. And in the morning, when Daniel came to wake him, Dalton was gone, as peacefully as Violet had gone before him. They buried him beside his wife, on the ranch they had built together, under the wide California sky. And on their shared headstone, Daniel had engraved words that Dalton had often said about the love of his life. "She warmed my heart for life, and I will love her beyond it." The ranch continued under Daniel's care, and then under his children's care, and then under their children's care, passing down through the generations. And the story of how it all began, of a blizzard and a rescue and a love that lasted a lifetime, was told and retold, becoming part of the family's history. A reminder that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best things, if you are brave enough to ride out into the storm.